The world watched as 78-year-old gospel legend Cissy Houston approached her daughter's casket. Television cameras captured every angle as celebrities and thousands of mourners held their breath. But what those cameras couldn't capture were the words Cissy whispered when she leaned over Whitney's casket in that final moment. Those words contained a lifetime of love, regret, and a secret Cissy had carried for 48 years. A vow she made before Whitney was born that would shape everything between them and ultimately contribute to the tragedy the world was mourning. 4:47 a.m. Cissy's sister Anne found her collapsed on the bathroom floor, convulsing with sobs. "I can't do this," Cissy whispered. "I can't stand in front of the world when my baby is gone." This was the fourth time that morning she'd broken down completely. But Cissy wasn't just grieving Whitney's death. She was carrying crushing guilt about a secret she'd kept for nearly 5 decades, a truth about Whitney's birth she'd never shared with anyone except her late husband, John. As assistants helped her dress, Cissy caught sight of herself in the mirror. Ancient, hollowed out. "Whitney would have done my makeup," she said quietly. "She always said I didn't know how to blend properly." The memory brought the smallest smile before tears started again. By 9:00 a.m., Cissy was heading to New Hope Baptist Church where she'd sung gospel, where she'd baptized baby Whitney, where she'd watched her daughter's voice soar above the congregation at 11. Now she was returning to say goodbye. New Hope had been the Houston family's spiritual home for generations. In 1968, 8 months pregnant with Whitney, Cissy led "How Great Thou Art" with such power that people felt the Holy Spirit move through the building. This church launched the Drinkard Singers, became the Sweet Inspirations who sang with Elvis and Aretha. This wasn't just a building. It was the foundation of everything the Houstons were. Thousands lined the barricaded streets. News helicopters circled. The funeral was broadcast live to millions, but Cissy barely noticed. Her mind was locked in memories. Whitney at 3, singing with perfect pitch. Whitney at 12, bringing down the house. Whitney at 48, calling at 2:00 a.m., "Mommy, I can't stop." Their last conversation was 3 days before Whitney's death. "Mama, I'm getting my voice back," Whitney had said from Lowe's Angels. "I'm going to make you proud again." Cissy had heard these promises too many times. "Baby, I've always been proud of you, but you need to be proud of yourself." 3 days later, Whitney was found dead in a Beverly Hilton bathtub. Inside New Hope, the atmosphere was both celebratory and devastating. The gospel community had turned out in force, understanding this was not just a funeral, but a homecoming for one of their own. The Sweet Inspirations sat together in the 3rd row, faces marked by grief and decades of memory. They'd watched Whitney grow from a curious little girl hanging around rehearsals to a global superstar who'd forgotten where she came from, only to desperately try to find her way back in her final years. The casket, covered in a cascade of white roses and purple orchids, held Whitney's body dressed in silver and purple. Makeup artists had worked for hours to restore the face substance abuse had ravaged in her final years, trying to make her look like the radiant young woman the world remembered from The Greatest Love of All video. They'd succeeded in making her look peaceful, but they couldn't erase the truth everyone in that church understood. Whitney Houston had died too young, destroyed by forces she couldn't overcome. Kevin Costner delivered an eulogy that had the entire congregation in tears. "Whitney was the girl you wanted as your best friend," he said, his voice breaking. "She was also the woman who fought battles most of us can't imagine, and she fought them with more courage than anyone knew." Alicia Keys and C.C. Winans performed "Send Me an Angel," their voices intertwining in harmonies that seemed to reach straight to heaven. Stevie Wonder sang "Ribbon in the Sky," his tribute to a woman he had mentored and admired. Through it all, Cissy sat in the front row, face an unreadable mask. Tyler Perry, sitting 3 rows back, later said, "I've never seen anyone hold themselves together with such visible effort." Her body was trembling, hands gripping the program so hard her knuckles were white, but her face never broke. I kept thinking, how is she doing this? How is any mother capable of this kind of strength? What nobody knew was that Cissy wasn't finding strength in the traditional sense. She was dissociating, a defense mechanism her mind had employed to survive the unsurvivable. She was floating somewhere above her body, watching the scene as if it were happening to someone else. The Cissy Houston sitting in that pew wasn't really there. She was somewhere in the past, reliving every moment of Whitney's life, searching desperately for the point where everything went wrong. for the moment when she could have saved her daughter if only she had known what to do. To understand what Cissy whispered, you need to know the secret that shaped her entire relationship with Whitney. August 9th, 1963. Whitney's birth was complicated. Cissy had severe preeclampsia in her 7th month that threatened both their lives. During those frightening hospital weeks, Cissy made a vow to God. If he saved her baby, she would dedicate that child's life to his service. The child would use whatever gifts God gave to glorify his name. When Whitney was born weighing 6 pounds 3 ounces with impressive lungs, Cissy knew God had answered her prayer. More than that, she knew this child was special. By 3, Whitney could match pitch perfectly. By 8, she performed solos that left the congregation in tears. The child had a genuine, undeniable gift from God. But Cissy's vow created terrible pressure neither fully understood. Every time Whitney showed interest in anything but gospel, Cissy felt she was betraying God. School play? No, it interfered with choir. Parties with friends? No, worldly entertainments corrupted her pure voice. Boys? Harsh rejection because they'd distract from her divine purpose. By Whitney's teenage years, the household was a pressure cooker. Whitney felt suffocated by expectations, crushed by a vow she hadn't made but was forced to carry. Cissy truly believed she was doing God's work. The conflict grew more intense each year. 1983. Whitney was 19 when Clive Davis saw her perform at Sweetwater's nightclub in New York. Cissy had been against it from the beginning. Sweetwater's wasn't gospel. It catered to R&B and pop crowds. But Whitney, legally an adult and increasingly rebellious, insisted. The night Clive Davis offered Whitney a record contract, Cissy and Whitney had the worst fight of their lives. Whitney argued this was her chance. Cissy countered that stardom meant nothing if it cost Whitney's soul, that the secular music industry would destroy everything pure about her gift. "You made a promise to God," Cissy shouted. Whitney, tears streaming, shouted back, "No, you made a promise to God. I never asked for any of this. I never asked to be your holy offering." That statement struck Cissy like a physical blow. For the first time, she realized the terrible burden she'd placed on her daughter. But instead of acknowledging this truth, instead of releasing Whitney from expectations that were never hers, Cissy doubled down. "If you sign that contract, if you choose that world, don't come crying to me when it falls apart." It was an ultimatum born of fear and love twisted into control, and it poisoned their relationship for decades. Whitney signed with Clive Davis. Her 1985 debut became one of the best-selling albums of all time. "Saving All My Love for You" and "How Will I Know" made her a global superstar. But the success came at a price neither anticipated. As Whitney's fame exploded, distance between mother and daughter grew. Cissy watched from the sidelines as her daughter transformed from gospel girl into pop phenomenon. Magazine covers, award shows, world tour, a life bearing no resemblance to the church-centered existence Cissy had envisioned. The gospel community began criticizing Whitney for abandoning her roots. Cissy heard whispers at New Hope, accusations that she'd allowed corruption by fame and money. Some suggested Cissy pushed Whitney into secular music for financial gain, a charge that wounded her deeply. The truth was more complicated. Cissy hadn't pushed Whitney into pop stardom. She'd fought against it with everything she had. Now, watching her daughter drift from the values she'd tried to instill, Cissy felt terrible guilt mixed with stubborn pride that refused to admit she might have been wrong. 1992. Whitney married Bobby Brown, and Cissy never approved of the union. She saw Bobby as exactly the kind of negative influence she'd always feared would come into Whitney's life. Bobby came from the streets of Boston, had a well-documented reputation for wild behavior, and represented everything Cissy believed was dangerous about the secular entertainment world. He was the living embodiment of all her worst fears for her daughter. "That man will destroy you," Cissy told Whitney the night before the wedding, her voice cold and final. "He's not worthy of you, and if you marry him, you're making the biggest mistake of your life." Whitney, hurt and angry, responded with words that would haunt Cissy forever, words that cut deeper than any knife. "At least he loves me for who I am, not for what he wants me to be." The statement hung in the air between them like a curse. Cissy wanted to respond, wanted to say that she loved Whitney for who she was too, but the words wouldn't come. Her pride, Her stubborn belief that she was right kept her silent. It was a silence that would cost them both dearly. After the wedding, Cissy and Whitney barely spoke for 2 years. The distance between them grew into a chasm that seemed impossible to cross. Cissy watched her daughter's career from a distance, celebrating her successes privately while maintaining a cold public silence. Whitney was determined to prove she could be happy without her mother's approval, even as her life began to spiral in increasingly dangerous directions. By the late 1990s, Whitney's substance abuse became impossible to hide. The woman with the purest, most powerful voice in popular music showed up to performances unable to hit notes that used to be effortless. Behavior became erratic. Weight fluctuated dramatically. Tabloids that once celebrated America's sweetheart now feasted on her decline with cruel glee. Cissy watched with horror and helplessness. Part of her wanted to reach out to help, but another part, still burning with anger over old conflicts, remained stubbornly distant. She made her choices, Cissy told friends. She chose Bobby Brown. She chose that lifestyle. Now she has to live with consequences. But in 2002, watching the Diane Sawyer interview where Whitney looked gaunt and defensive, something inside Cissy broke. This wasn't the confident superstar who defied her. This was a sick woman who needed help. Despite all their conflicts, all the years of tension, she was still Cissy's daughter. Cissy reached out for the first time in years. The conversation was awkward, filled with long silences. "Baby, I can see you're struggling," Cissy said, her voice softer than it had been in decades. "I want to help you." Whitney's response was heartbreaking. "Mama, I don't know if anyone can help me. I've gone too far down this road." What followed were years of attempted interventions, rehab stays, relapses, reconciliations. Cissy became intimately familiar with addiction's brutal reality. The way it turned the person you loved into a stranger. The way it made promises it could never keep. The way it destroyed everything it touched. Through it all, there were words Cissy never said. Words she held back because she couldn't bear to speak them. Words that contained both apology and acknowledgement that might have changed everything if spoken sooner. 2011. Whitney was filming Sparkle, a remake about a girl group in the 1960s. The role was perfect because it allowed Whitney to return to gospel roots while confronting addiction demons through her character. For the first time in years, Whitney seemed genuinely hopeful. Cissy visited the set several times. Mother and daughter began rebuilding their relationship. They talked about the past with more honesty than ever before. Whitney admitted she'd used drugs partly to escape the crushing pressure of perfection. Cissy acknowledged she'd been too controlling, too rigid. "I wanted to give you the world," Cissy told Whitney. "I wanted to give you a purpose bigger than fame or money." Whitney took her mother's hand. "But Mama, I just wanted to make you proud. I wanted you to love me for being me, not for being some chosen vessel." It was their most vulnerable moment in decades. For a brief time, it seemed they might finally heal the wounds that had festered so long. But addiction is a patient enemy. It waits in shadows, watching for weakness, and it never truly releases its grip. Now, standing at Whitney's casket on February 18th, 2012, Cissy was about to do something she'd never done in 48 years. Tell Whitney the complete truth about the vow, about the crushing expectations, about the words she should have said years ago but had been too proud, too stubborn, too afraid to speak. Cissy approached the casket, dimly aware of cameras, thousands of eyes watching, the weight of public expectation. But all of that faded when she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. Whitney looked beautiful in death, more peaceful than Cissy had seen her in years. The makeup artists had erased addiction's ravages, restoring the luminous beauty that made Whitney a global icon. But Cissy didn't see the icon. She saw her baby girl, the child she'd brought into the world with such hope and love, the daughter she'd tried so hard to protect that she'd driven her away. Cissy leaned down, lips close to Whitney's ear, and began to whisper. Words came out broken by sobs she could no longer contain, but she forced herself to say what should have been said decades ago. "Whitney, baby, I need to tell you something. Before you were born, when I was sick and the doctors said we might both die, I made a promise to God. I promised him that if he saved you, I would dedicate your life to his service. I would make sure you used your gift for his glory." Tears flowed freely now, dropping onto Whitney's still face. But baby, I was wrong. I was so wrong. That vow wasn't mine to make. Your life wasn't mine to dedicate. I took your childhood, your freedom, your choices, and I gave them away before you even had a chance to claim them. Cissy's voice dropped even lower. You told me once that you just wanted me to love you for being you. And I did, baby. I always did. But I was so afraid that if I released you from the expectations, if I let you just be Whitney instead of Whitney Houston, the chosen one, the anointed voice, that I would be breaking my promise to God. I was so afraid he would punish me by taking you away. A sob racked Cissy's body. She paused before continuing. And in the end, by holding on so tight, I lost you anyway. I drove you away with my demands, my control, my inability to just let you be who you were meant to be instead of who I needed you to be. Cissy touched Whitney's folded hands gently. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm sorry I made your gift feel like a burden. I'm sorry I made my love feel conditional. I'm sorry I was so focused on the promise I made to God that I forgot the more important promise every mother makes, to love unconditionally, to accept completely, to let them find their own path even when it terrifies you. The final words came in a whisper so soft even Cissy barely heard herself. You were always enough, Whitney. Just as you were, without the voice, without the fame, without any of it. You were always enough. I just wish I had told you that when you were alive to hear it. Cissy straightened up slowly, her body feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She looked down at Whitney one more time, memorizing her face, then leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead with infinite tenderness. Fly away home, baby, she whispered. Fly away home where nobody can hurt you anymore. As Cissy turned from the casket and walked back to her seat, something remarkable happened. The entire church rose in silent tribute, not the usual applause and cheers. A reverent acknowledgement of a mother's grief, collective respect for pain too deep for words. Tyler Perry, who watched with tears streaming, later said, I've never seen anything more powerful. Whatever Cissy said to Whitney, you could feel it ripple through the church. It was like watching someone's heart break and heal at the same time. The funeral continued with more music, more testimonials, more tears. But the moment everyone would remember was Cissy Houston's private goodbye. Those close enough to hear fragments chose to keep those words sacred, understanding some things are too holy to share. After the funeral, Cissy returned to New Jersey and began the long process of grieving not just for her daughter, but for all the years they'd lost to misunderstanding and pride. She would later say that losing Whitney taught her the most important lesson of her life. No promise made to God is more important than the promise to love your child unconditionally. In 2013, Cissy published Remembering Whitney, writing with brutal honesty about her relationship with her daughter. She acknowledged her failures, her controlling nature, her inability to see Whitney as anything other than a vessel for God's glory. She wrote about the vow, though she didn't reveal the full details of what she'd whispered at the casket. I loved my daughter more than life itself, Cissy wrote. But I loved her wrong for too many years. I loved her with conditions and expectations instead of acceptance and grace. If I could go back, I would tell her every single day that she was perfect exactly as she was. I would make sure she knew my love had nothing to do with her voice or success or ability to live up to some promise I made in a moment of fear. The book became a bestseller because Cissy's honesty about her failures resonated with parents everywhere. How many mothers and fathers, reading her words, recognized their own mistakes? How many realized they'd been loving their children with conditions attached, trying to shape them into idealized versions instead of accepting who they actually were? Emily Cissy Houston continued to perform and teach gospel music until her late 80s. She established the Whitney E. Houston Academy of Creative and Performing Arts in Newark, dedicated to nurturing young talent without the crushing pressure that defined her daughter's childhood. The school's motto, chosen by Cissy herself, was simple but profound. Your gift is enough. You are enough. Students were taught not just music and performance, but how to maintain identity in the face of fame, how to set boundaries, how to seek help when addiction or mental health issues arose. Cissy poured all her regrets, all her hard-won wisdom, into creating an environment where young artists could flourish without losing themselves. In interviews during her later years, Cissy was often asked what she wished she could tell Whitney if she had one more chance. Her answer was always the same. I would tell her that the vow I made to God was my burden to carry, not hers. I would tell her that she fulfilled every promise simply by being born, by existing, by bringing joy into the world. I would tell her I'm sorry for making her feel like she had to earn my love when she had it from the very first moment I held her. When Cissy Houston died on October 7th, 2024, at 91, she was buried next to Whitney at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey. Her tombstone bears a simple inscription, "Reunited with my baby girl. This time I'll love you right." The story of Cissy and Whitney Houston is ultimately about the complexity of love. How we can love someone desperately, completely, and still hurt them with that very love when it comes wrapped in expectations and control. How promises made with the best intentions can become chains that bind the people we're trying to protect. And how sometimes the most important words we ever speak are the ones we say too late, to ears that can no longer hear them except, perhaps, in whatever realm exists beyond this one. What Cissy whispered at Whitney's casket that February day was more than apology or confession. It was a mother releasing her daughter from a vow that should never have been made, giving Whitney in death the freedom she desperately needed in life. It was Cissy finally, painfully, beautifully acknowledging that her daughter had always been enough, exactly as she was. In the end, the greatest performance Whitney Houston ever gave wasn't on any stage or in any recording studio. It was simply being herself, flawed and human and struggling and trying, and ultimately teaching the world through her mother's grief that unconditional love isn't about control or expectations or promises made to God. It's about acceptance, grace, and the courage to let the people we love be exactly who they are, even when that terrifies us. Cissy Houston learned that lesson too late to save her daughter's life. But by sharing her story, by being brutally honest about her failures, she gave that lesson to the rest of us while there's still time to act on it.